passing of my uncle had not been a great blow to me, other than in the sense that one is diminished by the loss of any kin. My father's brother was not well regarded in the family. He was not a religious man, did not keep Christmas, Easter, or other Christian feasts and holidays, and his occasional visits to our home always brought the feeling of great strain on both parties. We understood he lived alone in a modest home without servants, and neither my father or anyone else know how he kept himself. My mother said that the state of his shirt cuffs indicated that it was by precarious means. So it was with some surprise that I received a letter from my late father's solicitor advising me of the death of his former client's brother, and that I was the sole beneficiary of a will that had been written when I was still an infant. On arrival at Hunstanton, I met with my uncle's lawyer in his offices. He had little to say, other than that all my uncle's worldly goods now came to me, and that the total sum of his possessions was contained in the house, his horse and trap having been sold a short while before his death. His clerk had arranged for the property to be secured, he explained, after they had been notified of his death. With great solemnity, he slid a new-looking padlock key across the leather-top expanse of his desk. I asked him how my uncle had died, at which he became evasive and pointedly took a large silver half-hunter from his waistcoat pocket. When I asked for the way to the property, he stood up swiftly, and summoning his clerk to direct me, bade me farewell. I gained the impression that my uncle's solicitor had no more enjoyed his client's company than had his own brother. I had brought an overnight case, intending to spend the night at a hotel, and then see about my uncle's house the following day. But having been assured that the house was not so far from town, I thought I would save the expense and try to get there by nightfall. The clerk had not been entirely truthful about the proximity of the house. A crow might have been able to fly there in a short time, but it transpired that there were no direct roads, and the place was quite remote. Also, the cart that I rode on took a circuitous route, as it had a number of other deliveries to make on the way, so it was with some exasperation that we arrived just as the light began to fade. The cart came to a stop at the end of a hollow which led through ancient woodland, and ended where the woodland began to give way to sand and scrubby grass that ran down to the sea just out of sight. The house was not a ruin, but like its recently deceased occupant, had an appearance of neglect, or at least want of care, except for a new padlock and hasp that had clearly been recently fixed to the front door. I praised my driver, a taciturn local man, on his knowledge of the paths so as to be able to find this remote place without error. I pressed a silver coin into his hand to ensure his prompt return the following day. He thanked me, and lighting his clay pipe said, "I were born in this parish and knew all this house, or at least knew of its whereabouts. You seem like a gentleman, but no disrespect if the man was kin to you. The owner of this house had a reputation for not being so." He regarded me steadily and continued, "I brought the solicitor's men here after your uncle was found. They wouldn't take a step inside. They made me wait while they secured the door and fitted the lock, then I took them straight back." "Was my uncle found inside?" I asked. My driver ignored the question as if I had not spoken. "I hope you conclude your business here in good time, sir," he said, "and I'll be here for 2 o'clock tomorrow." He handed me down my bag and box of light provisions I'd bought in town. Then he turned the cart and was gone. As it disappeared from view, I realized woods were utterly silent, and the only sound that could be heard was the wind shifting on the sands, a long, hissing sibilant as the dunes shifted with the veering breeze. Something about that restless hissing unsettled me. Clutching the key in my hand, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake in committing myself to spending a night here. However, I had not seen a sign of an inn or a neighbour within 4 miles, and I did not care for that walk in shoes better suited to the paved streets of the city rather than rough cart tracks. The key turned easily in the new lock on the splintered door. Inside, I was surprised to find that although untidy and covered in a quantity of settled dust of some weeks or months, the house seemed habitable. There was a simple stove with a hob, some dry wood and kindling, a coal scuttle, and even a nearly full box of candles. Downstairs was but one room, comprising the hearth and its stove, a rustic table and chair set for simple dining. Next to the hearth was a single good chair with a thick blanket folded over its back and a footstool. By its side was a small tin trunk with no lid. This was evidently full of papers and correspondence. In the far corner was a wooden box which contained my uncle's clothes. I surmised that the rest of my uncle's furniture and effects would be in the bedchamber above, which I decided to explore next so as to make myself comfortable for when night fell. The stairway was not much more than a ladder, and I made my way up it tentatively, candle in hand, feeling each step groan and give a little under my weight. As my head raised above the floor of the upper room, my candle followed, bringing a soft light to what was otherwise profound darkness. As my eyes became accustomed to the dim light, the first thing that I noticed, to my great dismay, was that the room contained no bed or any other stick of furniture that could be used for repose. From this I inferred that my uncle must have slept downstairs near the stove, wrapped in that blanket. The room had 2 windows, both covered over with thick brown paper, so that not even a glimmer of the dying evening light made its way through. The room was bare, save for 2 wooden trunks, except on closer inspection I noticed by the light of the candle that there were strange markings on the floor. Some were simple abstract shapes, and others were words in a language I had never encountered before. I crossed the room and knelt before the first of the 2 trunks and opened it. It was not locked. Books and papers, some candles, some cheap brass bowls, and some cloth bags containing a pungent substance. A number of the books appeared to be very old, and their bindings were disintegrating. Opening 1 or 2 of them to see if they might have any value, I saw only Latin texts and some designs similar to those wrought upon the floor. A sharp crack on the stairway made me start, and I turned, fully expecting to see the head of a curious local emerging from the stairwell. But there was nothing and nobody there. My constitution is not given to starting at odd noises or creaks on stairs, but there was something about the silence of that house that unsettled me. I turned to the second box and opened it, and the light of the candle bathed me in the reflected light of gold. The second trunk, as carelessly unlocked as the first had been, was filled to the top with gold. Sovereigns and coins from previous centuries were tumbled together with heavy jewellery and priceless trinkets as if they were trifles from a child's toy box. How had my uncle come by such riches? Why did he live downstairs in such austere circumstances when above his head was more gold than a man could lift? I pondered this matter, careless at how my candle burnt down, until another sharp crack from the stairwell brought me to my senses again. My head swimming with the possibilities rendered by this inherited treasure, I dragged my mind back to the stove downstairs, and that it would need feeding if I were to spend the night in that forlorn chair with anything approaching comfort. In one of the cupboards near the stove was a bottle of port nearly full. I filled a glass with the 1 tin cup I had to drink from. I lit 2 more candles, and setting them on the table, proceeded to empty the contents of the box of papers onto it. It was full of letters and correspondence, mostly from antiquarian booksellers in London and Paris, and receipts and accounts from the meagre life lived in one room with all that wealth above. The only other object was a large book bound in fine leather. By its size and thickness, I first thought it to be a Bible, but when it was opened, it appeared to be some kind of journal. Inside the front cover, I could see the embossed name of one of the finest stationers in London. This book stood out as a thing of quality in a house otherwise bare of luxury. Its thick, creamy pages were filled with my uncle's meticulous hand. Page upon page was filled with his neat copperplate handwriting. I had a notion that it might be a scientific journal of some kind, as it had some of those qualities, and as an apothecary by training myself, I understood how a man of science might keep a record of his experiments. But this was no science I could understand. For each entry there was a date, time, and some symbols. I saw the sun and the moon, and I recognised the signs of Venus and Mars, so I gathered that the symbols I did not recognise must also be of astronomical or astrological significance. My uncle had used a form of notation of his own devising, which made many of the entries impossible to decipher. And then there were such puzzling entries as
performed full ROC, but still no full appearance, though I noticed that the birds were again silent, and stayed so until dawn.
Followed by further entries with more dates, symbols, and simply the word nothing for many pages. These pages covered the course of some years, but nothing of note appeared until a date of full 2 years before my uncle's death. In this were dates, more symbols, some of which were heavily underscored for emphasis, and underneath was written,
I noticed a change in the atmosphere as soon as I began the ROC. First the birds became silent, then the wind dropped. Then almost as if they were shadows, I saw the forms come out of the sea. They stood with head and shoulders above the waves, observing me. I stood my ground and observed them also. In time, they walked free of the waves, and I could see them in their entirety. Like men, but in so many ways, not like a man. In outline, they had the appearance of well-muscled men of 6 feet or more, but it was in the details that their variations were most apparent. Their skin was slick and grey-black like an eel's, and they were as smooth as eels also, with no hair. As they walked in the dying sunlight, I could see their eyes were huge, black, and glittering with a pitiless intelligence. I composed myself as they arrived at the appointed place I had marked in the sand, and they engaged me with those black eyes that spoke of countless fathoms. I greeted them in the manner prescribed by my books. They made no sound, but I could tell that my entreaty to them had been heard. I made my request, and again they made silent answer, making clear their dreadful end of the bargain, which I dare not write here. They turned silently to each other and then to me. The largest of their number, who seemed to be a leader among them, then pointed one long, glossy finger to the full moon rising in the east, and I understood that we would meet again on the first night of the full moon.
This appalled me. The contrast between my uncle's meticulous notes and the recounting of some seeming phantasmagoria with all the qualities of an opium-induced nightmare was stark. What could it mean? Was my uncle not merely an eccentric, but actually quite mad? I poured a second glass of port and continued to read.
They are back again, this time without bidding. They bring more gold, but I have no more need of it, though still they expect payment.
Then, a month later,
more gold, but I cannot pay the price any longer. It becomes more dangerous.
Another entry.
They come without bidding and without gold. They demand their half of the bargain. I cannot. The crying and pleading of the sacrifice destroys me and reminds me of the great peril of my soul.
Then, a cutting from a local paper, dated some 2 weeks later, had been pasted into a page containing details of a missing child. Below it, in a wildly erratic hand which was barely legible, was written,
God forgive me. They give me no peace.
And then nothing else. The rest of those creamy white pages were blank. I sat as the candle shrank down, my mind racing with feverish thoughts. Was it possible that my uncle's such a madman that he had stolen children to use in his unspeakable occult rites? And if he was indeed mad, how had he acquired all the gold and treasure? From the bottom of the sea and the grey eelmen he claimed to have summoned? It was altogether too monstrous to contemplate. I poured more port with a trembling hand, more than I was used to drinking, admittedly, to steady my nerves and prevent my mind from flying from thought to thought. Before long, I was overcome with a great weariness as the day's travel and mental exhaustion, and fell into a stupor. Fatigue and the port must have overwhelmed my rational mind, because at some point I fell asleep and I dreamed. My dream was filled with the sound of shifting sands that endlessly moved and hissed, and I was walking, stumbling in the dunes of this fine, ever-shifting sand. It swept over me, and I fought to remain upright, but constantly it moved, this way and then that, and always in that sighing, insistent sibilant, which forever sounded like a sharp breath being taken before an act of pure wickedness. I tumbled and fell until I came to the wan moonlight shoreline, where, unlike the restless land, the waves appeared motionless. In the distance, a short way out to sea, I could see dark shapes coming, and sensed with dread that they saw me, and at once began a steady progress in my direction. I woke with a start, the candles quite out and the stove cold. I sat for a moment, reminding myself of where I was and why, and expressed to myself some harsh feelings towards my uncle and his insanity, which had leached from the pages of his journal into my dreams. I lit a match to look at my watch, and swore an oath out loud when I saw that it was another 4 hours until dawn. As I sat there, I perceived a flicker of moonlight. There was something in the brevity of that flickering that made me instantly alert. It was too brief a pause for it to have been caused by a cloud moving over the face of the full moon. It seemed to me that something had passed by the window for a moment. I was immediately on my feet with a hastily lit candle in my hand. I had bolted the door securely when I arrived, as it was the only way to keep the ruined and patched object closed. But I felt the need to return and make sure that it was indeed fastened. As I put my hand on the cold iron of the bolt, the door gave a groan as if a huge weight had been applied to it, and it began to buckle inwards. The moonlight flickered once, twice, in response to further movement outside. The habitual silence of the house was broken by the sharp snap of a twig outside and a soft shuffling sound. With 2 bounds, I leapt across the room and grabbed the chair, which I dragged against the door, wedging it against the only sturdy crossbeam. I added my weight to the chair and sat there, my feet braced on the floor for the rest of the night, terrified. Twice more before dawn that strange flicker in the moonlight returned, although the moon had lowered in the sky. Then there was a terrible clattering, which seemed as loud as a peal of bells, but was in fact the hasp of the door being pawed at a few inches away from my head on the other side of the door. Then that abated, and silence. 2 hours later, without warning, the door was once struck with an immense blow, causing the bolt and hinges to groan and shifting in my chair with me in it a full 2 inches. And then nothing again until dawn. It was only when the full light of morning had arrived that I felt safe enough to move. I slid the bolt away from the door and cautiously went outside. I saw nothing to indicate the night of terror that had just passed. As I circled the house, I found a handcart with iron wheels buried in the weeds and knew then what I must do. I returned to the upper room and flung out the contents of my uncle's trunk of books. Then, dividing the gold between the 2 trunks, the weight became manageable enough for me to lower them both down the stairwell on the end of a rope. I was then able to drag them to the yard and heave them into the handcart. Forcing the wheels of the rickety old cart over the sand dunes was hard work for a man unused to manual labour, and my hands and feet were sore and blistered by the time I had accomplished my task. It took 2 trips, taking 1 trunk at a time and leaving them at the shoreline at low tide. By the time I was done, my hands were bleeding and the tide was coming in. I returned to the silent house, retrieved my things and my overnight case and set them outside the door. I pushed the books and papers I had thrown down the stairs into the centre of the room and then added the box of correspondence and my uncle's journal before soaking them with the dregs of a bottle of lamp oil and setting them alight with my last match. As soon as the fire was well alight, I dragged the table and chairs on top of the flames, then retreated to the door as the tiny house began to fill with black smoke. It took no time at all for the old shack to be well alight, and picking up my overnight case, I trudged back through the woods to where the hollow way met the main cart track. I stood there an hour before my driver and cart arrived at the appointed time. If he was surprised to see me at the junction rather than outside my property, he said nothing. The old shack was in poor condition, I said, and when I lit the stove this morning, the chimney caught alight, and now the place has burned to the ground, I lied, as I climbed up into the seat next to the driver. Probably for the best, sir, said he, and for a second I thought I saw a brief smile of satisfaction pass his otherwise impassive face. Then he stirred the reins and said something incomprehensible to his horse, who immediately started off at a swift pace. I looked behind me at the receding woodland and at a single black column of smoke in the distance. I knew within an inner certainty that the 2 trunks of gold I had seen being covered by the tide would not be there this evening. They would be gone by the time the full moon rose again in the east, and the tide once more turned away from the shore and those hateful, shifting sands.